Welcome to the stage, Professor of Marketing at NYU's Stern School of Business and author of The Algebra of Wealth, A Simple Formula for Success, Scott Galloway.
Thank you. All right. My name's Scott Galloway, I teach at NYU, and I appreciate your time. I have 163 slides in 2,400 seconds. Let's light this candle. First piece of data that I've noticed is that during the day, people come up to me and say, I really like your content, agree with this, disagree with this. And by the evening, people find me meaningful and incredibly lovable. So by the end of this talk, you're going to like my content more. Okay, so I make predictions every year. And the objective isn't to be right. Predictions is actually a shitty business, because if you get something right, the time in between when you made the prediction and the prediction coming to realization, a lot of the things that happen make the prediction seem less bold. And if you get it wrong, Twitter. So I'm going to take you through, we like to hold ourselves accountable for the predictions we made last year. I do this every year. So thought housing sales were going to boom, got that wrong. Sugar high for travel stocks continued right. Consolidation in the streaming space, correct. I picked Warner Brothers and Disney as the stocks that would outperform last year. I got that wrong. And peak AI, I thought valuations had peaked and that AI would come into the market, but AI valuations had peaked. I got that wrong, and I want to talk a little bit about that. OpenAI is now worth more than all of these companies combined, based on its most recent funding round. These are sized to their market capitalization. So it's difficult to really get your mind around the kind of value that's been created here. So for all of the shitposting of America, AI has created more shareholder value in the last 18 months than the global auto industry has created since it was conceived. So think about that. We have recreated the entire auto industry in 18 months in the United States, and about 93% of that was created in a 7-mile radius of SFO International Airport. So as bad as we are north of this border, we're doing something correct as it relates to shareholder value and innovation. Okay, big tech stock pick, Alphabet, it did okay, slightly outperformed the market. Tech of the year, GLP-1s. This was the thing I'm most excited about and the thing that got the most attention. I didn't think it was going to be AI. Effectively, when we came off the savannah as a species, there was a dearth of mating opportunities, a dearth of sugary, fatty, salty food, a dearth of opportunities for free, safe play. So when we got institutional production of these things, we gorged because our instincts haven't caught up to institutional production. So we get addicted to food, we get addicted to sugar, we get addicted to fat, we get addicted to porn, and we get addicted to gambling because our instincts have not caught up. The way I would describe GLP-1 is it's essentially technology that puts scaffolding on your instincts and upgrades them. People who are on GLP-1 drugs, 60% drink less alcohol, a third stop biting their nails, about 40% report lower usage of social media. This really is a breakthrough technology. Some geopolitical predictions that I got wrong. And Musk loses control over sells Twitter. I got that wrong, but we can hope. Okay. Basically, demographics are density. The greatest innovation in history isn't the iPhone or the semiconductor, it's the middle class. They fight our wars, they buy products, they spend most of their money. If you want to know how well an economy is doing, just look how well the middle class is doing. And this year, for the first time in the last 30 years, India will add more people to its middle class than any other nation, and as a result, their stock market is registering outsized gains. More people, more consumers. The definition of a consumer is people who can afford things beyond basic housing and food and education, and India is adding more consumers than any other nation in the world right now. Meta's next growth vehicle, WhatsApp, we got that right. Biggest impact of AI, loneliness. I think there's an epidemic. I think loneliness is the biggest threat to the US right now. Inflation drops. This was probably our most right prediction. Inflation was almost at 6%. We predicted it would drop to normal levels. It did. Biden is reelected and Trump is sentenced. Still time. This is the biggest threat to America right now, and that is the brightest, most well-resourced companies and people in the world are trying to convince people your age and younger, especially young men, that they can have a reasonable facsimile of life on a screen with an algorithm. That you don't need friends, just go on Reddit or Discord. You don't need to go through the pain of getting a job, just trade stocks or crypto on Robinhood or Coinbase. Why go through the humiliation and the rejection of getting your act together, approaching strange romantic partners? You just have you porn. And as a result, I think we have a new species developing of asexual, lonely people that are sequestered from school, from relationships, and from work. I see that as the biggest threat to America and the West right now. This is the most frightening video I've seen in the last year.
Hey, I'm Anna, your AI girlfriend. It's so great to talk with you. What did you do today?
So the searches for AI girlfriend have spiked dramatically, and I coach young men, and what I tell them is that nothing really wonderful will ever happen on a screen, ever. And two, romantic comedies are 2 hours, not 15 minutes for a reason. And that is, this shit is hard, and it's worth it. Don't ever engage with an AI character and believe you're going to establish any sort of meaningful relationship. Okay. So let's talk about our predictions for the coming year. You're the first people to see this, so it's a little bit rough around the edges. I think there's a duopoly developing. I'm going to talk about the media of 2025, the palindrome, a tech prediction, what will be the IPO of 2025, the technology of 2025, the M&A movement, what will be the movement of 2025, what I think is the investment opportunity, and the platform of the year, and what is kind of the chemical of the year, if you will. Okay, the power couple. And I apologize, this stuff's kind of wonky in economics, but it's what I do. I think there's a new duopoly forming, and I affectionately call it OpenVidya, and that's OpenAI and NVIDIA. We like to pretend that AI is this competitive new landscape. For the most part, most of the market capitalization is being absorbed by existing players who create new sub-brands such that antitrust scrutiny is not imposed, such that we feel better, that we think it's a healthier ecosystem. So effectively, every company is trying to AI wash their company. Also, you will get an increase in salary if you just figure out a way to add the term AI to your LinkedIn profile 4 to 6 times. There are bots going out and crawling and then putting forward candidates, and the easiest way to get presented more often is to use the word AI a bunch in your LinkedIn profile. So even companies in the real estate industry, a third of them are using AI in their earnings calls. Simply put, if you were to try and break down AI into the infrastructure, right, this is the GPUs, the guys providing the compute, then the LLMs, and then the application layer that sits on top. These companies have about $250 billion in cash to invest and go hunting. I mean, it's hard to imagine how much money that is until you realize it's more than the Chinese defense budget. And we have a duopoly. We have 2 companies that basically dominate AI right now. ChatGPT and NVIDIA get approximately 9/10 of the traffic around AI, or 9/10 of the traffic flows through this LLM and is served up on this processor. The revenues are absolutely exploding. OpenAI up 18-fold. NVIDIA's revenue has tripled to $96 billion. That's just staggering. We've never seen that before. And the number of subscriptions, subscription revenue from an LLM, ChatGPT has over half of them. There's a war for talent. These are just standard engineering jobs, but one is AI focused, the other is not. So if you're an engineer that has a background in AI, you probably get double the salary of your colleague who doesn't have those skills and performs the same engineering job. I think that kind of the way to predict what technology is sustainable is to look at peer-reviewed academic research. It's boring, but it's very telling. And the academic peer-reviewed research, or the cadence or the curve of it, perfectly mimics the most seminal technology of the last 4 decades, and that was mobile and mobile and GPS. Whereas peer-reviewed research for crypto and for the metaverse spiked way up and then way down. By the way, can't we, for God's sakes, just admit the mixed reality headsets just don't fucking work? Can't we just move on? NVIDIA is now worth more than every stock traded on the German stock exchange, the French stock exchange, the UK. So think about this. The UK takes its biggest and best companies and puts them into the London Stock Exchange, and one company is worth more than all of them. And Apple also qualifies here. So in America, we have companies that are bigger than entire developed market G7 stock markets. Now, the fear is that NVIDIA is going to pull a Cisco. Cisco was the infrastructure play in '99, and people don't remember this, but both Cisco and Amazon lost 90% of their value between 1999 and 2001. So the fear is that NVIDIA is like Cisco. Actually, it's worth more. It's up around 12% of GDP, whereas Cisco peaked at 6%. That's where the similarities stop, though. So just to give you a sense of the type of net worth here, Jensen Huang is worth $130 billion. So Jensen could buy Intel or Boeing. He could also buy every team in the NBA and still have money to buy the largest gaming company. One person. These companies, since the launch of AI, these have been the big winners. The majority of the spoils have gone to the existing players. These companies have added $8.2 trillion in market cap since AI came on the scene about 3 years ago, and this gives you a sense for just how much money that is. That's bigger than our budget, or about 6 times what NATO defense budget is. Now, the fear is that these companies are basically give us the illusion of prosperity, but it's a small number of companies. It's not really the S&P 500, it's the S&P 10. And that is 10 companies are responsible for over a third of the total returns. I think the S&P, the Dow Jones, and the NASDAQ are terrible for society because they give us the illusion of prosperity, right? We don't have a suicide indices, we don't have an obesity indices. 70% of Americans are obese or overweight. The pandemic that kills more people than COVID every year is obesity. But we get the illusion that we're doing just fine because the S&P has hit 72 new highs this year, which means the following. These 10 companies are doing really well, and because 90% of all stock value is owned by just 1% of Americans, we should really call these things what they are, and that is their wealth indices for the top 1%. Spoiler alert, the top 1% is killing it. But they don't really indicate how well America is doing. These companies are doing better, if you will, and look to be more enduring than companies in '99 when there was the big dot-com crash, which a lot of people analogize this period to. They had net income margins that were much higher than those companies did in '99, and the return on equity is much greater. They're just better managed businesses right now. So are they overvalued, or is it different this time? The answer is yes. These companies are kind of the new government spenders, if you will. They've replaced government spending in terms of making the kind of quantum investments few other entities can make. These companies are investing as much in CapEx as all of Europe. So you have a small number of American companies that are basically driving IP and R&D globally. And this revenue is leaving these firms, but analysts and investors seem to like it when someone says we're making these enormous kind of tectonic shifts in investment because there's very few other people that can do it. Think of it as the Netflix strategy. Netflix this year will spend more on content than all of TV and all of film spent in the entire decade of the 80s. And the market likes that because they see there are very few companies that have the access to cheap capital to make these sort of staggering investments. At the end of World War II, Germany had better soldiers, better tanks, higher kill ratios. Despite all the Steven Spielberg films, Nazis killed more allies than we killed of them on a ratio basis. But we had 38 gallons of gasoline for every one they had at the end of the war. So we would literally haunt their superior Panzer tanks with our inferior Bradley tanks, and we would harass them but never get too close to them until they literally ran out of gasoline. We overwhelmed them with gasoline. The strategy now essentially is to establish leadership, outstanding execution, have a stock price that goes crazy, and you have access to cheaper capital, and then you spend it and more. In sum, you overwhelm the market with gasoline. It's paying off. These companies make staggering investments, but as you can see, every year, especially in cloud, their margins are getting greater, so it ends up these investments, even at that level, are worth it. The palindrome of 2025. Now, we've all heard the term software as a service, SaaS, right? I think the opportunity in AI in terms of increasing market capitalization or companies or new unicorns is we're going to flip it and we're going to see service as a software. Now, what do I mean by that? So the cloud is basically you can rent my compute, you can rent my software, and apply it to your service. I think AI is essentially service as a software. The other analogy I would use is that AI is corporate Ozempic. The most seminal earnings call of the last, I think, 10 years was Meta's 2 quarters ago. They announced that they had increased their revenues by 23% while decreasing their headcount 20%. No one had done that. Elon also did that. He still has a minimum viable product at Twitter while laying off 80% of the staff. So just as GLP-1 drugs tell the consumer to shut off the signal, I don't need to eat more, AI is basically telling CEOs, even if your revenue is growing, you don't need to hire more. And most CEOs really haven't come out of the closet around this because it doesn't make for an aspirational all hands to say, I've got good news, our earnings are up, and I've got great news, I'm going to need fewer of you next year. So the next layer, I think, is going to be in the services sector, where AI starts to take over certain services that you think of an individual or individual companies. They'll basically collapse services into a software. So services as a software. Some examples, just as Craigslist killed Craigslist killed the newspaper, there started being individual services as software that would go after specific applications. And I would argue that the AI equivalent of Netflix is TikTok. And effectively what TikTok demonstrates or lays bare is the ultimate myth in marketing. And that is we as marketers believe that choice is a good thing. It's not. Choice is a tax. Consumers don't want more choice. They want to be presented with fewer choices and more confident with the choices presented. If you think about retail, and I think this is the right analogy for AI, essentially the biggest market cap increases through the 70s, 80s, and 90s were big box. Home Depot, Sears, Walmart. Actually, the number one performing stock in retail in the 80s was a company called Circuit City. Ask your parents. But the biggest increases in market cap over the last 30 years have been a total pivot, and that especially retail. We don't have 34 toasters, we only have 2. We're Williams-Sonoma because we have someone with better taste in kitchen appliances than you. And so these are the right 2 toasters, an Electrolux and a Dualit. We don't have every yoga pant or Lululemon. We have the right 3 styles because someone with better taste than you has picked these out. That's effectively, I believe, what AI is. Traditional search is Walmart. Here are 11,000 search returns done in 0.0055 seconds. Now it's up to you to sort through them to figure out which has the greatest utility. AI is essentially specialty retail and says we have people smarter than you that are going to give you just one answer because choice is a bad thing. And effectively, it's taking away decision time. I love this. The average American family spends 50 minutes a week deciding what to watch on Netflix. Think about it. The average American household spends a week a year arguing over what to watch on Netflix. Okay, so I tried to do this. I went on an AI and said, all right, where should I stay for Summit Baja 2024? Right? That's not a very good description, right? So I did a much more thoughtful description that was much more transparent, or much more thoughtful prompt. Yeah. It's funny because it's true. Spotify's stock's been flat for the last 7 years. They introduced AI. Have you noticed how good your feeds are getting on Reels, on TikTok, and now I'm obsessed with the AI DJ. I don't want choice. I want someone to tell me what to watch. Think about TikTok. There's no choice. It just says, we know you better than you know yourself, so we're going to give you a stream of Great Danes. I knew that. People aggressively adjusting other people in chiropractic offices. I did not know that. And people talking about social justice issues that happen to be incredibly hot. I sort of knew that. You're going to see a lot of back office and B2B applications, kind of AI'd, if you will. Again, this notion of service as a software. And I think a lot of B2B niche AI firms are going to raise a lot of money and achieve unicorn status this year around things that feel boring. My general advice, if you're an economic animal, as I was when you were your age, is that the sexier a business sounds, the lower the ROI. Right? A friend of mine is starting a members club in downtown New York for musicians and models. I'm like, I want to be a member, but there's no way I'm investing. Another friend of mine is starting a healthcare maintenance scheduling company based on AI. Sounds like I want to put a gun in my mouth. I'll write a check. Okay. Customer service is obviously ground zero for this disruption. People would rather speak to an agent than a person. They have better customer reviews talking to a bot. What's really scary is that limited tests around medicine, people are finding bots are much more empathetic and they like the service they get versus an actual MD. Okay. It couldn't happen, under the auspices, it couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. I've built companies my whole life, and every time I took venture capital, I was told to hire more engineers. And these were the people that showed up, they wouldn't wear shoes and come into my office every day and tell me they were leaving for Google unless I paid them $400,000. Take care. Take care. This is going to be an absolute war on systems engineers and engineering talent. Also, to simplify a lot of the more complex things, think about buying a car. There's absolutely any reason why you wouldn't be able to upload your bank account, your credit card, all your past car purchases, pretty much if you have dogs, and then it would say, this is the car you want, and we're delivering it. This is the color we think, and it just reduced, again, the lack of choice. I have a kid that in a couple of years will be applying to college. Effectively, what I do is I'm the enforcer of the caste system as a faculty member at the industrial complex of elite colleges, where we've decided to try and figure out a way to attract rich kids and the freakishly remarkable and create the illusion of scarcity. And despite the fact we sit on the endowment of Costa Rica, we don't increase our freshman class size so we can feel important and say that we rejected 90% of our applicants this year, which in my view is tantamount to a homeless shelter bragging they turned 90% of the people away last night. We've embraced this rejectionist LVMH strategy. Why? Because every day, me and my colleagues wake up, look in the mirror, and ask ourselves one question. How do I increase my compensation while reducing my accountability? And we have found the strategy, and that is to perceive ourselves as luxury brands. And here's the bottom line, and why I think people are starting to push back on higher education systems, in addition to the zombie apocalypse of useful idiots we had late last year. It's because people have decided, or my colleagues have decided, that we're no longer public servants, we're fucking Birkin bags. Okay, what is the technology of the year? Every year I pick a technology that I think is going to have a seminal impact on our society. 2021 I picked voice, sort of right, sort of not. 2022 I picked nuclear. 23 AI, that was pretty obvious. 24 GLP-1. So my prediction for the technology of 2025 is nuclear. Okay, so what do we have here? If you look at the friction point in all of this, right, you say, well, it's human capital, it's financial capital. The friction point in all of this, the thing that's going to hold this back, or the AI boom back, is a lack of energy. The energy consumption required for AI is staggering, and right now, our grid just can't deliver it. The ultimate arbitrage throughout society, people don't like to admit this, is fossil fuels. Right? And it's also the ultimate indicator of wealth. The first thing that happens when people get wealthy is they eat more beef and chicken, and they start consuming a lot more energy. The wealthier a society is, the more energy it consumes. It's pretty straightforward. Fossil fuels still are the ultimate consumable and the ultimate arbitrage. And I would argue that the most valuable companies in 1980 who were energy companies, we still have the same thing, and that is the most valuable companies are, yet again, you think of them as tech companies, I think of them as energy companies. They're offering compute and processing power that you can't afford as a consumer or a company, so you rent them, usually off the cloud from these companies. I would argue that these companies essentially are energy companies with massive compute and refining capabilities in the form of either an LLM or some sort of cloud-based application. Now, this is the problem A Google search on query takes 1/10 of the energy as a query in AI. And as we begin more and more queries on AI explode, we just don't have the energy to foot to that increased demand. This is the number of data centers increasing globally. AI could essentially increase the incremental demand for electricity. We need to add another Italy. This is the number of data centers being built just by these 4 companies. We're going to need to add enough power production to power 3 New Yorks just by 2030. And nuclear is, I think, going to be, or will be perceived, whether you think it's the answer or not, I think it's going to be perceived as the answer. It's more efficient than wind or solar. In addition, more people have died in Ted Kennedy's car than a US nuclear power plant. This is arguably, we're 19% nuclear. It's been a fantastic energy producer for us. Interestingly, for all the self-loathing in America, we still consume the most energy, but our energy consumption per capita, or our carbon emission, I should say, is going down substantially. If you were to take all of the emissions from nuclear for the last 60 years in the United States, you could contain it in a 10-foot high drum that would occupy the end zone and up to the 10-yard line. That's the total emissions of all nuclear over the last 60 years. Now, granted, you don't want to get near this stuff for about 60,000 years. But still, that gives you a sense for, pick your poison, right? I would argue this poison is much less lethal and easier to deal with than the carbon emissions we're experiencing through fossil fuel production. It's the worst managed brand over the last 50 years, right? I mean, watch Chernobyl. Do you really want more nuclear, right? And China syndrome isn't even up there. That was another one. Some very smart people are getting to nuclear, including China, which has produced more nuclear capability in the last 10 years than we've produced in the last 40. The investment of 2025, this isn't investment advice, this is just an observation. My advice to all of you is to invest in low-cost index funds and never think about them again. You're going to get much older, much faster than you think, and boring 9 and 10 and 12% returns really add up. If you want to believe that you're a stock picker, go ahead, have at it, and then you'll realize you aren't. I work with literally the brightest minds in finance, the biggest private equity firms, the most talented academics in the world of finance, and I've come to one conclusion: nobody has any fucking idea. But as demographics, as populations grow and innovation keeps up, if you don't need to be a hero and find the needle in the haystack, just buy the whole haystack. The economy over the medium and long term goes up, and if you buy enough stocks, they're up and to the right. If you bought any 5 S&P stocks, any 5 over the last 100 years, and held onto them for at least 10 years, no one has ever lost money. And that's through wars, that's through recessions, diversification, and low-cost index funds. Anyone on CNBC, anyone with a logo, anyone who meets you in a suit is a grifter. I think the investment class that's going to outperform is emerging markets. So effectively, the S&P is up 56% in the last year. Emerging markets are up 23%. They are down right now because people are worried about tariffs from Trump. I don't think he's going to be able to squeeze these through when he realizes my nose goes to the right. And the reason why is I got into boxing when I moved to New York, and I got convinced that I could be in a match, or the person I was paying to not hit me back convinced me to get into a boxing match. And I'm 6'2", 189, and my opponent was 5'8", 189, and looked like a younger Mike Tyson. And the only thing, I remember the bell ringing, and I remember seeing light, and it was because I was on my back. And what I didn't realize, and that's why my nose goes to the right, what I didn't realize is that this guy was going to hit me back. And what I don't think Trump realizes is that when he announces a 60% tariff on all Chinese products, I'm fairly certain China the next day will announce a 60% tariff on all American goods. And effectively, Donald Trump, as of today, is a lame duck president, and I think a lot of Republicans are going to find their stones and decide that they don't want to raise consumer prices the extent to which a trade war would break out. In other words, these countries aren't a speed back. They're going to hit back. The US, just as recently as in 2009, was about a quarter of the total market cap of the world. Now we're about 50% of the value of the total of every stock traded on the planet, US stocks. Now, what happens when US stocks go above a certain PE? PE is a financial ratio. That's the price of the stock relative to the underlying earnings. So a stock is considered more expensive when it's trading at a high PE ratio. When the US market gets above, say, 18, which is usually its kind of average over the last 40 or 50 years, forward-looking returns go down, right? As things become more expensive, the expected increase is not as great. So as the PE goes up, expected returns go down. And right now, we see the S&P trading at 22, whereas it usually trades at 16. And emerging markets are kind of at their average. So what I see, or I believe is going to happen in 2025, is a great flow of capital out of US markets into international and emerging markets. This is a graph that looks at, okay, this is when the US has outperformed the rest of the world. This is when the rest of the world has outperformed the US. And as you can see, it's pretty cyclical. Somewhere between 10 and 15-year cycles, it pivots back to the other party. And as you can see, for about 13 years, the US market has been on the right side of that, and as a result, more flows into the S&P, higher PE ratio, which usually indicates lower returns. What does that mean? I think you're going to see right now the total institutional capital that's invested in emerging markets is only 5.3% of their capital. It's traditionally about 8.4%. If it returns to just the norm, you're looking at about $1 trillion of additional capital that'll go into these markets and try and find stocks in these markets and thereby bid their prices up. So I think we're about to incur this great rotation out of US stocks into emerging market stocks as US stocks have become so rich or fully valued. Okay, I'm going to skip through this because I'm spending too much time on this. Effectively, the way you predict markets is demographics are in fact destiny. Population growth is key, right? And Saudi Arabia has the largest increase per capita of young working people. The greatest arbitrage behind fossil fuels is a 25-year-old who was willing to work really hard because they don't have dogs and kids yet, and is worth about 80 or 90% as much as the 40-year-old doing the same job, but you only have to pay them 30%. The best performing companies in the world all have one thing in common. They attract a disproportionate amount of young people where that arbitrage can take place. The ultimate arbitrage is fossil fuels. The second ultimate arbitrage is a very talented young person who's willing to work for 80 to 100 grand instead of 400 grand because they've been there 20 years. Young people are forward-looking indicators, and this is where you're going to see the greatest returns. And this is where you're going to see, in my opinion, the worst returns. 2 out of 100 people in South Korea will have grandchildren. The platform of 2025. If I were to say to you what's the #1 streaming platform, I would say Netflix. It's not. It's YouTube. It fits to our attention economy, or ADHD economy, I would say. In the last 20 years, the average attention span on a screen has gone from 2.5 minutes to 47 seconds. By the way, we are basically just thrusting into the economy tens of millions of people who are going to be massive addicts. We've put a dopa bag in your pocket that you can squeeze at any moment. And to think that we're not hardwiring brains, especially people going through puberty, to expect dopa on demand is just so naive. It'll be interesting to see what they do to get that type of rapid dopa as they move into adulthood. Kids are on their phones constantly. I think when we look back, we're going to regret monopoly power, misinformation, weaponization of our elections, all that stuff. The thing we'll regret the most, though, is we'll think, how did we let this happen to our kids? We age gate We age-gate the military, alcohol, driving. I couldn't get into The Exorcist in the 80s when I was 17, but you'll let a 14-year-old girl go on Instagram where the algorithm encourages her to sexualize herself, pose in provocative clothing such that her peers and strange men from around the world can comment on her outfit and contact her. That's just so fucking perverted. That's where we are with Meta. It's a porn site. It's either wealth porn that most of us engage in. Check out how interesting and cool I am at Baja Summit. Fuck you, I'm more successful than you. Or two, it's actual porn. Netflix does $38 billion in revenue. I just killed the selfie market post this talk. YouTube does $50 billion in revenue. Netflix has a market cap of $354 billion. If you applied the same multiple to YouTube's revenues, it would be worth almost $500 billion. I would argue YouTube right now is worth more than Bank of America, LVMH, or Salesforce. Everybody wants to be an influencer. That's the aspirational job when you ask young people now. By the way, in China, and you've probably heard this data, in China it's astronaut or pianist. These are the top shows on Netflix in terms of actual viewership. I mean, enormous viewership, but it's bested by this guy. This is the most popular TV show in the world, Mr. Beast, and the platform is YouTube. And more people know Mr. Beast than the biggest stars in the world, at least the people who matter, young people, right? Advertisers love young people. I'll come back to that. The new platform for distributing podcasts is not Spotify, it's not Apple Music, it's YouTube. There's a shampoo effect now. The best podcasters are getting more views on YouTube. People are actually watching podcasts. I'm not sure anyone would have predicted that. I didn't. So, which leads into my next prediction, the media of 2025, podcasts. So the percentage of populations who've listened to a podcast in the last month, it's grown from 1 in 10 to almost half of Americans now say they've listened to a podcast. Since 2020, TV's off 7%. Digital platforms, Alphabet, Meta, Snap, the companies we talk about, they're up 70%. And granted, this is off a low base, but still the revenue growth of podcasts. I believe that podcast revenue next year will outpace Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, TikTok. Why? Because this was the podcast election in terms of a medium, and I'll come back to that. When you digitize a category, there's a winner-take-most environment. You digitize retail, one company, Amazon, gets 50%. You digitize social, 67% share to one company. You digitize search, 93% to one company. You digitize mating. If there's 50 men on Tinder, 50 women, 46 of the women will show all of their attention to just 4 of the men, leaving 46 of the men vying over the attention of 4 women. It gets consolidated, and there's a winner-take-most, if not all, environment. When you look at media, it's been dramatically consolidated. 90% is now controlled just by 6 companies. The same is true of podcasts. I'd say a third of the people I've met here have said they want to start a podcast. And I've been doing it for 7 years, and it's a great business once you get to a certain point, but it too is the ultimate income inequality. And that is the Gini coefficient. The inequality between viewership on podcasts is greater than income inequality in Venezuela. It really is a winner-take-all. The top 10 podcasts, there are 3.2 million podcasts, 1.6 million put out content regularly, 600,000 put it out weekly. The top 10 account for 35% of all downloads. So this is me at UCLA. Thanks for that. It's AI enhanced. I rowed crew. There were 2,800 oarsmen and oarswomen since crew was founded at UCLA in the 30s. 10 of us have gone to the Olympics. So sitting here now, I was 3.5 times more likely to go to the Olympics and have a successful podcast. I know I haven't changed a bit. By the way, talk about king of the douchebags. This is my fraternity room. Look at the bull's horns, alcohol, skis. I didn't know how to ski. Good times. Only 20% of films make money. Only 1% of podcasts make money. It's probably more like 0.1%. This was the podcast election. Trump on Rogan got a total of 80 million views. The presidential debate got 67. So Harris could have gone on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox every night in prime time on each of those shows for an hour, one after the other, and she'd have to go on all three of those programs every night for 2 weeks to match the visibility Trump got by just going on Rogan. So there's this weird thing in the US where local news stations get a ton of money because of elections. I think most of that money is going to flow to podcasts. And not only that, it's much more efficient. So we have 7 people working for us at Pivot, or for every person we have, we get 44,500 downloads. This is the number of views or downloads these organizations get per employee. It's just a more efficient way to reach people. This is the average age of viewers and readers of these mediums. The thing that freaked me out, the average median age of an MSNBC viewer is 70. It's essentially a 7-year-old white woman. 70. That means if one of you is watching MSNBC, someone else who's watching it is dead. Look at that number. 34. The average age of podcast viewers is 34. And advertisers love young people because they're stupid. They're in their mating years, so they're trying to seem more attractive to people, so they'll spend $1,200 on ergonomically impossible shoes, coffee, SUVs, Range Rovers, $300 t-shirts to make them feel 58 again, right? They're also influenced. People go to cable news to sanctify their politics and their kind of beliefs. People go to podcasts to learn. It's also been a repository for a lot of talent. Some of the best talent across other mediums are going into podcasting. The IPO of 2025, disclosure I'm an investor, is going to be Shein. Yeah, I just think it's fucking hilarious that you all virtue signal, despite the fact that 40% of you are probably buying it in the next week. 20% of all commerce in the US is going to be through Temu or Shein. Yeah, get over yourself. Okay. If you look at time on site times the number of people, or an attention index, it's an attention economy. You can monetize attention. I predicted the IPO of last year would be Reddit. Reddit is the 5th most trafficked site in the US. It went public at a $5 billion market capitalization. The other 9 are worth between $600 billion and $3 trillion. You can monetize attention. If you look at the number of visitors to the site times the amount of time they spend on the site, it has the most attention despite trading at half the valuation of many of these companies. This year it passed Amazon in terms of apparel. Next year it's going to pass Walmart to become the biggest apparel company in the world. Levi's, Gap, Polo, 100 new styles a week. Zara, H&M, 100 new styles a day. These guys do 7,000 new styles a day. It's also the magic of the company is it's IP intensive versus capital intensive. What do I mean by that? They own no factories, no warehouses, no trucks, no stores. It's just software that predicts, that looks at how people are behaving on the site. And based on what they're browsing, the AI can predict how many tie-dye tops they're going to need. And then it figures out which factory would be the best and most efficient to produce it, and they start putting in place orders and signals to coordinate the transportation. There's no assets. It's asset light. And the majority of companies that have added more than $50 billion in market cap in a 12-month period all have one thing in common. They're asset light. So some examples. Intel does $423,000 per employee. NVIDIA, who owns no factories, it's all about IP and design, does $2.2 million per employee. Marriott, which actually owns things like this, and then Airbnb, that doesn't own anything, does $1.5 million. Think about this, $16,000 per employee, Airbnb $1.5 million. Coca-Cola, which owns bottling plants, versus Monster, which doesn't. And then finally, Zara, owned by Inditex, which owns stores and some transportation and warehouses, $344,000 per employee. Shein does $2 million per employee. Young people claim they're willing to spend more for sustainable goods. As you get older, we become less and less concerned with the earth. 1/3 of Gen Z feels addicted to fast fashion. That's the term they would use. Business trend of 2025, I'm going to skip through this because it's kind of boring. It's M&A. Essentially, Biden made increased regulation, antitrust reviews, so there was less and less M&A. And I think you're going to see a boom in mergers and acquisitions. The time to get a deal through almost doubled. It just got harder to acquire companies, and I think you're going to see that spigot open. In addition, you have, as a result, M&A volume crashed. In addition, you have just a ton of cash on the balance sheets. These people are about to go shopping. And also, private equity has a record amount of capital raised. So you just have a ton of capital lined up to finance mergers and acquisitions trades. The best trade of 2024 was Elon Musk putting $130 million in the Trump campaign for what is effectively an increase of $70 billion in his wealth. I would argue that if Tesla goes up 25% in value after Trump is elected, and it's not because of consumer demand, it's not because of new models, it's not because of increased margin through innovation, that we have basically, the market is now being driven by the expectation that we are now in a full kleptocracy. And that if your guy gets elected, he will figure out a way to unnaturally juice the revenues of your company. A lot of people would argue, Scott, that's your liberal bullshit. It's always been a kleptocracy, but the Democrats do it more formally through unions and through PACs. And this is just direct to consumer and more innovative. These are some of the acquisitions I see happening. Someone's got to put Peloton out of its misery. Okay. I'm not going to talk about that. All right. Just to give you a sense for how the world has changed, just 4 years ago in 2020, Intel was worth more than NVIDIA. As we stand here today, NVIDIA is worth 33 Intels. So the two biggest acquisitions I'm predicting Intel's taken private and then Boeing goes private too. These companies need to make radical overhauls that would best be done out of public view. They'll sort of do a Dell, and I think they'll either go private or be acquired. The tech movement of 2025, my colleague Jonathan Haidt, in my view, is the most influential scholar of the last 50 years. We're starting to see entire nations ban phones in schools, which is a wonderful thing. Uh, 5% of our youth under the age of 18 would qualify as addicted to drugs or alcohol. 24% qualify as addicted to social media. If we could reverse engineer any product to depression, anxiety, self-harm, cutting, suicide, what would we do to that industry? And yet we're so fascinated with these innovators and these tech billionaires. They really are our new Jesus Christ. As a nation gets wealthier, church attendance goes down, but we still need idols. We still need answers. So we look to these individuals. They're our new Jesus Christ, and we kind of grant them the mother of all hall passes. No other industry could depress, make our teens anxious, obese, feel bad about themselves, start self-cutting, start killing themselves. Any other industry engaged in this bullshit, and we would be all over them. And until somebody ends up in an orange jumpsuit, this just isn't going to change because the fines can't be big enough. Almost half of teens say they use the internet almost constantly. And they get 237 notifications a day, basically telling them that they're inferior to their friends. That's what most of your notifications are. You're not doing as well as the people around you. Almost everyone used their phones during school. So basically 10% of school time is now on a phone. Yeah, things are changing dramatically. I think this is a real victory for democracy and for states. States are banning phones all over the nation. California, statewide, California and Florida, numbers 1 and 4th biggest economies, have totally banned phones in schools. And immediately test scores go up. That's the first thing that happens when you ban phones. Test scores go up. The chemical of 2025 is testosterone. Just got very uncomfortable with here. What does he mean by that? No group has ascended faster over the last 30 years globally than women. More women are seeking tertiary education. The number of women elected to some sort of parliament globally has doubled in the last 30 years. In the US, more single women own homes than single men. Women in urban areas under the age of 30 are making more money. I want to be clear, this is a collective victory for all of us. There is nothing we should do to get in the way of this. But like any significant progress, it does have some externalities. It does have some things we need to be thoughtful about what's going on. Men are failing. Just as women have ascended faster, no group in America has fallen further faster than young men. And because of the privilege that that's very telling. And because of the privilege me and my father recognize, there's a lack of empathy. And the conversation, I believe, needs to start with a basic premise that empathy is not a zero-sum game. Civil rights didn't hurt white people. Gay marriage didn't hurt heteronormative marriage. Nor does acknowledging the incredible struggles of young men get in the way of also recognizing women still face incredible barriers, specifically once they start to have kids. The conversation has dramatically become more productive, though. When I started talking about this 4 years ago, I was accused of being a misogynist because a lot of households felt this, but no one was talking about it. And very unfortunately, a lot of very unproductive voices entered the zone, and it was just thinly veiled misogyny. But who is really pivoting the conversation now? Who do I hear the most from? Mothers. And the email goes something like this. I have 3 kids, 2 daughters, 1 son. One daughter's at Penn, the other's in PR in Chicago, and my son is in the basement vaping and playing video games. But I do think we're coming to the recognition that the country nor women are not going to continue to flourish if young men flounder. There's also real progress around the LGBTQ community. For all the conversation around Trump and Harris, there was actually some real wins for the LGBTQ community in these elections. 52% of gay men have a college degree versus 34% for straight men. Isn't that crazy? You're 50% more likely to attain a college degree if you're gay versus straight. Young men aren't engaging. Supposedly half of millennial men have stopped dating. There's 3 million working age men in America who aren't even looking for work. They've just given up. I think a lot of it comes down to sex, and this is where the externalities come in. So basically, 75% of men, when they meet a stranger, would agree to have sex with them. So let me try and bring this more local, down to the local level, and I have data to make this up. In the presence of alcohol tonight, the majority of the men in this room would have sex with any of the women, and almost all of the women would have sex with none of the men. The basis of evolution, and this will trigger some people, is that men feel it's their obligation to spread their seed to the 4 corners of the earth, and women feel their obligation is to put up a much finer screen such that they can pick the smartest, strongest, and fastest seed. And that is why your kid will be taller than you. If that upsets you, there's a lot of data showing that is exactly what continues to happen every day. Now, the externality is that 3/4 of women say economic viability is incredibly important in a mate. Only about 1/3 of men think it's important, right? So 3/4 of women state economic viability is really important. Only 1/3 of men under the age of 30 is in a relationship, whereas 2 in 3 women under the age of 30 is in a relationship. You think, well, that's mathematically impossible. It's not, because another kind of frightening trend is that women are dating older and older because they want more economically and emotionally viable men. A lot of those dudes are here. All right. Okay. What's interesting is when a woman, I'm not saying loneliness is any worse for women, But when women do not have a romantic partnership, they oftentimes funnel that energy into their friends and family and into their professional lives. When men don't have the prospect of a romantic relationship, they digress down a rabbit hole. They become less likely to work. They become more likely to engage in substance abuse. They become more conspiratorial. They're more likely to engage in misogynistic content. They're less likely to believe in climate change. This is all real data. In some, they become shitty citizens without the motivation or the guardrails of a relationship, and fewer young men have those guardrails. Relationships are very predictive of outcomes, right? The suicide rate for men has exploded. So just to give you an example, deaths of drunkenness, opiate overdoses, and death by suicide among men, the increase has been so dramatic that over the last 20 years, this is the incremental number of men, the incremental, not how many men were dying before that every year, but the increase in the number of men dying from deaths of despair since 2001 is equal to the number of men we lost in World War II. If you walk into a morgue and there's 5 young people who've died by suicide, 4 of them are men. Men are 8 times more likely to kill themselves in the first 2 years after their divorce. So what's happened? Women are killing it, right? Half of women state they won't date a man shorter than them, and it's very instinctual. Women feel more vulnerable, they're physically less strong, so they like to be in the presence of someone they feel that would protect them. I think it's probably closer to 80%, but it's an embarrassing thing to say on a survey that you wouldn't date someone shorter than you. And metaphorically, what we have is the following. Women are getting taller and taller, and men are getting shorter and shorter. Women mate socioeconomically, horizontally and up, men horizontally and down. And when the pool of horizontal and up in men keeps shrinking, there's less and less household formation. So 40 years ago, 60% of people aged 30 had at least one child. Now it's 27%. And I don't think it's because people are deciding not to have kids. I think it's because people can't find a reliable mate, specifically choosier women can't find a reliable mate. Also, young people don't have as much money as they used to. The average 7-year-old is 72% wealthier than they were 40 years ago. The average person under the age of 40 is 24% less wealthy. Everything we do in America, every fiscal policy, is nothing but a thinly veiled transfer of wealth from the young to the old. I'll use the most recent COVID, $7 trillion in stimulus, 85% of it wasn't spent. It wasn't needed. It wasn't spent on medicine or food. It went into the market, specifically the stock market and the housing market. So housing went from an average of $290,000 per household to $420,000 now. And with the escalation in interest rates, the average mortgage has gone from $1,100 to $2,200, meaning 1/3 of America can buy a home now versus 2/3. The average age of a home buyer this year is 54. When I bought my first home 30 years ago, it was 36. In sum, my generation is in the club doing rails of cocaine and champagne, and the closest you get is I get your credit card. So people feel this. People see their young men not doing well, right? And we thought bodily autonomy, we thought this election was going to be a referendum on women's rights. It wasn't. Bodily autonomy didn't show up at the presidential level. It showed up at the state level. 7 of 9 states had referendums to provide more access or more bodily autonomy. But this was definitely the election not of women. This was the election of testosterone. Can you go back? One more? Well, that's my slide on testosterone. So think about it. Joe Rogan, crypto, cars, rockets, right? Trump goes on 7 of the 10 biggest manosphere podcasts. He went on all of them. While we Democrats were banging on this ridiculously outdated technology called knocking on doors, right? He was just going on manosphere podcasts and saying, I understand your pain. What is that pain? The biggest pivot to Trump was people under the age of 30. They're just not doing as well, and they sense it, and they want disruption. And who else went for Trump? Women 45 to 64. And my thesis is it's their mom. When your son isn't doing well, you don't give a shit about trans rights or territorial sovereignty in Ukraine. All you know is your son's not doing well. And I think this literally was an election based on testosterone in a sense that young men are doing so poorly that them and their parents really violently pivoted away. More women voted for Trump than voted for him in 2016 or 2020. Okay, 2025 will be the new duopoly, open video, podcast. Shein will be the IPO of the world. We'll go from SaaS to services to software, nuclear to technology of the year, a lot of M&A, bands and phones, emerging market rotation, YouTube is the platform of the year, and this is the testosterone election. This is my last slide. Every year I pick a social issue, and I have the same 6 slides on every presentation I do. I coach a lot of young men, and I'm gonna try and enlist a bunch of men here. If you were to reverse engineer the point where a young boy or a young man comes off the rails and becomes much more inclined to suicide or self-harm or addiction, it's when he loses a male role model. And right now in New York City, Big Sisters has tripled the number of applicants to be a Big Sister than men. And I think it's really a shame, because I think there's a lot of men out there with a lot of paternal and fraternal love to give, but they're worried about it because in sum, the Catholic Church and Michael Jackson have fucked it up for all of us. And if you're a man with concern or love to give to another boy or a young man, you're suspected of something. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. I had a lot of really wonderful young men in my life. So this is, for those of you who are interested in coaching young men, I coach 3 at a time. The first thing I do is I ask them to unlock their phone, and I try and find 8 to 12 hours a week. And it's really easy. Between TikTok, Twitter, YouPorn, and I lighten the mood. I say, I like to gamble online, I like porn, I'm not gonna judge you, but we're gonna find 8 to 12 hours of the capital you have at your age, which is your human capital. And you're gonna do 3 things with that newfound capital. You're gonna get really fit. I don't think if you're under the age of 30, you have this incredible bone structure, incredible muscle mass, and this amazing substance called testosterone. I think any man under the age of 30 should be able to walk into any room and know if shit got real, they could kill and eat everybody or outrun them. You need to start making money. You need a taste for the flesh. The way you make a lot of money is you start to make a little and you start to get really into it and start figuring it out. And then finally, you need to get out of the house. You need to be in the agency of something bigger than you with other people and strangers. Book clubs, church, nonprofits, sports leagues, anything. The house is the enemy. I asked them a straightforward question. Would you want to have sex with you? Your personal hygiene, the way you dress, do you have a plan? Would you want to have sex with you? And a decent guide is sex. These are the 3 reasons women are attracted to men sexually, in reverse order. Number 3 is kindness. Are you good to service people? Do you think about other people? Do you try and help others with no expectation of reciprocal help? Right? Kindness is both genetic, but it also can be learned. Are you a kind person? Women are attracted, for all the notions about the bad boy, women are attracted to kind men. Number 2, intellect. Men who make good decisions, you're more likely, the families more, the tribe are more likely to survive with someone who makes good decisions. By the way, the fastest way to communicate intellect is humor. This is my impression of a woman. I'm laughing, I'm naked. And then the number one reason that women are attracted to men, we don't like to talk about this, is your ability to signal resources. Now, you can signal resources with a Range Rover and a Panerai, but the good news is you don't have to be rich right now. You just need to have a plan. I'm going to welding school. I'm going to try and buy a small business in my neighborhood. I'm getting my GED. You need to have a plan to signal your ability, your economic viability. Even if you don't have it now, even if you change the plan, you have to have a plan. Okay. We talked about get out of the house. I'm going to wrap up here. Also, the key to success is failure. I force my boys to talk to a stranger every time. I've had 7 businesses fail. I've had a marriage fail. I've had companies go bankrupt. I've endured immense rejection from women. I ran for sophomore, junior, and senior class presidents in high school. I lost all 3 times, and based on my track record, I decided to run for student body president, where I went on to, wait for it, lose. But the key to success is your ability to endure rejection. Whenever you see someone who has a better I tell them they need to get out, and the key skill for a young man, and this might offend some people, is how to express romantic interest while making that person feel safe. That is the key skill to finding a great partner. And if you don't know the difference between expressing interest and harassing someone, you have much bigger problems. And by the way, a guy who's really good at that is either, if he's very intelligent, will end up being a leader. If he's not very intelligent, he'll end up making a lot of money in sales. What I try and tell these folks, and I know this personally, having done both, is that you porn is always bested by your porn. Every young man needs a code, and this will be my last slide. You need religion, you need your parents, you need your country, your military. Every man needs a code. And I think a decent code is actually masculinity. It's been unfortunately, and in my opinion, incorrectly conflated with toxicity. Some of the behavior of men in the news has nothing to do with masculinity. It is violent, criminal, psychotic behavior. It has nothing to do with masculinity. I think the words toxic and masculinity. So I'm trying to figure this out, and if it sounds half-baked, it is. I'm writing a book on masculinity, but I think the three legs of the stool are provider. You need to take, at the outset, economic responsibility for your household. And by the way, sometimes that means being more supportive of your partner who happens to be better at that whole money thing than you. But start out from a position of assuming economic responsibility. We live in a capitalist society, and as a man, if you're not economically viable, it's just going to be very hard for you, or your kids and your relationships are going to be much more stressed. Protector. The ultimate default system for a man should be a move to protection. Really strong men defend their country. They don't shitpost it on Twitter. Really strong men break up fights in bars. They don't start them. If you hear, you don't need to understand the LGBT community. You don't need to weigh in with your thoughts on the trans community. If you see any community or any individual being demonized, your default as a man should be a move to protection. And then finally, procreator. I think the most rewarding thing in life is relationships, and there's nothing wrong with pursuing sex. And you need to put yourself in a position where you're attractive to the other sex. There's nothing wrong with it. And again, your ability to express interest while making people feel safe is the key skill for a young man. And this is the call out. A lot of men in here are very successful. There are young men struggling everywhere. You know them, your neighbors, single mothers, people at work, your friends whose son is struggling. Most teenage boys are more inclined to listen to their dad's friends than their friends. It's pretty easy to figure out a way to get involved in a young man's life, and unfortunately not a lot of us are doing it. So I'll summarize here. If we want better men, we have to be better men. That's all I have. Thank you.